You have touched upon one very important facet. You have mentioned something, and I have seen a commonality between the religious preachers of Hinduism, or perhaps I should say this is common in any religious seeker from different religion. But I'll focus on Hinduism. Swami Vivekananda, yes. If I go into the writings of Radhakrishnan and Aurobindo Ghosh, if I go into his writings, before even they go into the facets of the religion, the first thing they talk about is Akhand Bharat, or it is critical to unify India first, and then we will talk about the business. That's the kind of thing that we get. So this whole idea, and there is projected belief that one day we will get back this Akhand Bharat. Coming back to that aspect, how Vedanta plays an important role. And of course, when I speak about Vedanta, and I'm sure people who are watching this, the moment they will see the word Vedanta, the first expectation that pops up into the mind is Advaita Vedanta,
Right.
and which is not wrong. But at the same time, that Vedanta doesn't end in Advaita Vedanta. If you can enumerate that difference and
Sure, absolutely. So Vedanta has become to mean no more than Advaita Vedanta. But really, as you mentioned, Vedanta is a commentarial tradition of samvada, of discourse. And of course, it began with Shankaracharya positing that Brahman and Atman are
Mhm.
Advaita. And we have a body of text, Shruti, of course, Upanishads and the Vedas, of course, which all the schools of Vedanta, of course, have to think it's true, and also have to find the truth of their philosophy in those texts. So
Mhm.
they're commentarial traditions, and of course, uh, uh, although Shankaracharya posited Advaita, that if you read the Upanishads or read the Vedas, you will get Advaita out of it, right? Naturally, he had to address passages in the Upanishads and the Vedas that don't seem to indicate Advaita, that they seem to indicate that Brahman and Atman are different.
Mhm.
And so historically, we have the birth of Vishishta Advaita, Ramanujacharya, 11th century, and then Madhvacharya in the 13th century. And each one of them are offering their own interpretation of what those sacred texts mean, and what is the proper way to read those texts. And after all, there's an assumption that the texts are true, and there's an assumption that each one, Shankaracharya, Ramanujacharya, and Madhvacharya, have given a proper reading of those texts, and that the other Vedantins have given an improper reading, right? So at its core, it's a commentarial tradition that involves debate and justification for particular interpretations of particular texts and passages in the Upanishads more than any other body of text, the Upanishads. And so, of course, we have Brahmanuja, who believes that the relationship between the Atman and the Brahman are both the same and different. That when you get moksha, you have some identity and you also merge in some way with Brahman. And for Madhvacharya, it's the exact opposite of Advaita Vedanta. When you get moksha, you recognize your difference between yourself um, and Brahman or Vishnu in this case, and that if you saw things otherwise, then you won't get moksha, right? And each one of these schools of Vedanta is arguing against the other school. And it's very sad in a way when we think about the history of the recent history of Vedanta, that as you said, if you look up Vedanta, everyone assumes that it's Advaita Vedanta. But what they miss out on is the history of debate. And that's what's so dynamic and vibrant in Vedanta, is that it's a living tradition of debate. There are other schools of Indian philosophy, the Sankhya school or
Mhm.
Vaisheshika, which had a history of debate, but no one's debating them anymore. There are no living followers of Vaisheshika. Whereas there are living practitioners of Vedanta, of course, and they're living scholars and pundits of Vedanta who still engage in debates with one another about the proper interpretation of the Upanishads, about the proper interpretation of the Vedas, or most importantly, perhaps, is about internal incoherences in their opposing positions. So a good Vedantin, a good Madhva, will know the Advaita position very, very well, so well they can find internal inconsistencies in those positions. Not just inconsistencies in terms of the interpretation of the Upanishads, but flaws in the system itself, in the logic of the system.
Mhm.
And a good Advaitin ought to know the Madhva world, the Madhva doctrine very well too, in order to find and look for flaws in those positions. And a good Madhva scholar ought to be able to defend those accusations, and so on. And it's a really live debate that still happens today in India. If you go to mathas in India, uh, you will be fortunate to be able to observe some of these debates occurring, not just in the matha itself, but between Advaitins and Vishishta Advaitins, or between Advaitins and Madhvas. And I was fortunate to be able to observe some of these. And my early part of my career was engaging in these sorts of debates, of course, on paper. And I would write arguments against the Advaita school using, of course, Madhvacharya and Jayatirtha and Vyasatirtha, the followers, earlier scholars of the Madhva tradition. So Madhva Vedanta is important for Advaitins to know about, right? So if you think about Vedanta simply as Advaita Vedanta, then you are missing on the debate and the conversation that is essential for you to learn about Advaita Vedanta properly, right? Is that you must engage in debate, you must engage in defense, and that practice of debate and argumentation is essential to learning Advaita Vedanta properly. Um, Now, of course, there are masses who don't know the debates and don't know the texts and buy into it, but they do something not so different from the theists that they do not uphold in any high esteem. So if you merely deify Shankaracharya and you are merely a devotee and you don't look at the debate, then you're really not that different from those who worship Kali, let's say.
By reading about Advaita Vedanta, which basically claims that there is no difference between Brahman and Atman, and if I go to Madhva Vedanta, which essentially talks about there is the presence of of the difference between the Atman and the Brahman, and putting the Brahman, giving it a more superior form, and in Madhva Vedanta, it's Vishnu, Lord Vishnu. So, is it fair to say that the human population has a tendency to pick and choose between the Vedanta with respect to what they want? Because I have noticed, like, people who will meditate and they will talk about Advaita Vedanta. At the same time, these are the people who are also going to the temples routinely, because if they don't go to the temple, certain things are not going to happen. So this
Right. There's a tension there for
yeah.
sure in Advaita Vedanta. Right? And the response, a good Advaita response would be suggesting that in mundane reality, they act in ways that seem to be theistic, but ultimately all things are non-dual. Right.
Right.
So this is one excuse you can make, or one argument you can make to justify what appears to the outsider as normal kind of theistic, God-fearing practice, right? But it looks, if you are unable to articulate it in that way, then you're just being a confused Advaitin.
Fair to say that, or
Right.
what we say in common language is some sort of a blind faith
A
in
blind
doing
faith.
things.
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned about the debate. People should know this, that India has a tradition of documenting debate long back. I think the Samveda, which is one of the main texts that has talked about the whole approach to debate. I would tell you one incident and go slightly deeper into the Madhva Vedanta aspect. Is like the people have, or like in any form, like, we call it a customer behavior in the language of business, people try to do things which is easy to follow. And that is something also we have seen in the past religions. If the doctrine is easy, if there is less work to do, and still you can get salvation, I would rather choose that. I have noticed, like in the discussions of Advaita Vedanta, there is a general notion that it's too hard. It's an ideal state, as we call in science. Whereas if we talk about the realistic aspects of Vedanta, the moment we have a separation of or a hierarchy is created, things are seemingly easy. Coming back to that, why a easier Vedanta, or I would say a more realistic Vedanta, has got somehow limited to the southern part of India?
Right. This is a great set of questions. And I think I'll start with your last set of questions and move backwards. Okay. Is that I've written about this in different ways in some of my writings about how Madhva Vedanta is somewhat parochial, right? And that kind of parochiality it's limited to Karnataka in this interesting sort
Mhm.
of way, is partly because the popular scholarship in Madhva Vedanta is largely in Kannada. And if you're a Hindi speaker, you can't access these translations or these discourses, these pravachanas, which are all online. You can't access them if you don't know any Kannada, right? So there's an interesting rift, one could say, or barrier or chasm by way of language. Similarly, as I've written about for my dissertation and my second book, I think, I looked at the ways that the Madhva doctrine is regulated and made inaccessible, right? And so there are, and some of this is kind of classic Brahminical restrictions, but there are ways that Madhvas make sure that the masses don't have complete access to Madhva Vedanta, right? This is something that isn't particularly Madhva, but I think Madhvas do this to a higher degree.
Mhm.
Okay, and this also makes it less translatable, literally and figuratively, right? So you have textbooks on Madhva Vedanta written by Madhvas that are either in Kannada, which is not accessible to everyone, or if they're in English, there's so much Sanskrit in there that your average reader will not be able to read this book at all. This, of course, led me to write my first book on Madhva Vedanta, which was an introductory textbook intended for Madhvas and others and non-Madhvas who were not familiar with Sanskrit and Kannada for that matter. So you have a peculiar restriction to Karnataka and to Sanskritists, right? And then, of course, you add to that Udupi and the Matha in Udupi, the Udupi Sri Krishna temple,
Mhm.
founded by Madhvacharya, is the kind of central is the core temple, right? So you don't have a history of the spread of mathas like you do in Advaita Vedanta throughout India, right? It's located in Karnataka. There are the Ashta mathas, the 8 mathas, and they are in Karnataka, right? So you don't have subdivisions or satellites, one could say, throughout India. It's very specifically South Indian in this sense, and very specifically in the same way that you could say Vishishta Dvaita, you could say the same sort of thing, right? So with Advaita Vedanta, it has spread easily this way. Um, Equally importantly and worth mentioning is that their Madhvas certainly accuse Advaita Vedanta as being merely a pseudo Buddhism, right? And this is a pretty damning criticism, right? And that a lot of, if you read Shankaracharya and you remove the Vedas and the Upanishads from Shankaracharya, it looks a lot like some combination of Nagarjuna and
Mm.
Vasubandhu, right? And basically Buddhism. So Buddhism plus Brahman equals Advaita, and Varna equals Advaita, right? And so Advaita has been able to spread in a way that in partly in this way too, as a response to Buddhism, you get Buddhism plus Hinduism, and it becomes Advaita, and it's able to propagate in this way. But I think another point that you made that I want to really unpack is that you were discussing the difficulty in and ease in following these traditions.
Right.
And one could say that Advaita Vedanta is intellectually challenging, and so consequently, um, uh, attaining the right cognitive state, which is to say, finally denying the existence of your own Atman, right, is tremendously hard thing to do. It requires uh, uh, tremendous intellectual practice, right? And ironically, once you achieve that intellectual practice, you are not there to achieve it anymore, all right? So it's very, very, very difficult in that sense, right? It requires meditation and practice to finally rid yourself of a self. But that said, so it's intellectually challenging, no doubt. But that said, if you look at the practices in Madhva Vedanta, they might seem from afar to be easy. So simple bhakti, you might say, is an easy thing to do. But in the Madhva tradition, once you, what I like to characterize it as, you obtain moksha only through enlightened bhakti, right? So it isn't merely bhakti, but you need to have a sophisticated understanding of of the gods and goddesses, their places in a tadatamya, the hierarchy and the gradation, and the arguments against Advaita Vedanta, right? And all of those require a lot of intellectual effort too. You have to become a virtuoso reader of Madhva Vedanta in order to benefit from or to have a proper understanding of the sort of bhakti that you should have. So it isn't merely bhakti, but it's enlightened bhakti, right?
Right.
Now, add to that the numbers and kinds of rituals that you must engage in. There are scores of them, right? So the intricacies of being a madhva is itself a challenge. You have to do certain practices every morning, every day. You have to see the world always in terms of the um, the swatantra, the independence of Vishnu and the excellence of Vishnu. And if you err from that in any way, then you won't get moksha, right? So in the same way that denying the self in Advaita Vedanta requires tremendous um, practice, right, and intellectual strength and it's not easy, right? In the same way, having a proper understanding of Taratamya, gradation, and of the Madhva polemics and dialectics,
Mhm.
and finally having a proper understanding of Vishnu is also tremendously difficult and requires all sorts of prerequisites that makes it very hard too, right? And I would add that with Advaita Vedanta, it is somewhat easy to defend it. You could say, why do Advaitins, you can always refer to the mundane and the ultimate, right? Is that ultimately, like, yes, we are talking to each other. It seems like we're different people. It seems like there's difference, but ultimately there is no difference,
Right.
right? And I just haven't understood that yet, and you haven't either. I've only understood that intellectually, right? So that's somewhat easy in a way. Now, with the Madhwas, because they have such a rich system, there are lots of places where Advaitins are going to try and find flaws. And it's far more difficult to defend a system that has so many more components. So, as an intellectual exercise, I think that it's sometimes harder to follow a tradition like Dvaita Vedanta, or as one of my teachers at University of Chicago used to say, that it is far more difficult to defend Catholicism than it is to be an atheist. And he's right. That's to say that Catholicism has all kinds of problems and complexities, and should women become priests, and then you have all kinds of problems. And if you are skilled enough to be able to defend Catholicism like a good lawyer,
Mhm.
right, it takes a huge amount of intellectual effort. Whereas just saying you don't believe in any God is easy, right?
That's right.
Right. So I would say that both traditions are hard to do, right? In their kind of simplest level, they seem easy, but they're both very hard positions to uphold and defend and to make habitual, right? Because really, you have to make them. You have to make the denial of self into a habit,
Yes.
right? And then once it becomes a habit, then and you cease thinking about it, then you have achieved it, right? And it's the same way with Dvaita Vedanta, with Madhvacharya, is that you need to make worship of Vishnu and the centrality of Vishnu into a proper habit. You need to deny your own agency, right? You don't have any agency in Dvaita Vedanta. You are merely a puppet in the hands, so to speak, of Vishnu. And if you think you have any agency, then you will be erring, and you won't be having the right cognitive habit. In the same way, if you think that you completely understand Advaita Vedanta, then you're merely reasserting the self, right? So they're very hard things to do, right? And
Indeed.
in this connection, it's interesting. These were good, very good questions, right? Is that Advaita, you're denying the self, and in Dvaita, you're denying the agency of the self, right? And both are very hard things to do.
Indeed. Saints have mentioned that spirituality is something that comes with practice, and you kind of touched upon it. It's not like, reading the Vedas, because you kind of develop a certain sense of an ego when you just go through these sacred texts. But it's much beyond that unless things are put into practice. But at the end, it's a hard to follow path.
Tremendously hard to follow, very, very hard to follow, and it takes tremendous skill, time, effort, and I think that that these kinds of intellectual efforts, we often err when we make Indian philosophy too philosophical
Mhm.
because of the Western template,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And we forget that it is to be practiced, right? And so it's and similarly, if you make Hinduism too religious, then you forget that there's an intellectual component to it as well, right?
Absolutely.
So right, so it's um, I think that these are all very hard paths to follow, right? Right. So as much as I criticize Advaita Vedanta as a Madhva, or I have in the past, is that I also recognize the beauty of the position and the difficulty in following it.
Very
Right.
aptly said.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as both the schools of Vedanta proposes that all roads lead to Rome, and in this case it's salvation. So in your readings or research, have you found, like, are the agencies of salvation different, whether I come from the Advaita part or the Dvaita Vedanta part, or it's the same common destination?
Ah, I think that in the schools of Indian philosophy, that not all roads lead to Rome. Is that we're born in the cycle of birth and rebirth, karma samsara, and that if you don't have the right cognitive habits, then you will just get reborn in samsara. So if you follow Advaita Vedanta according to Madhvacharya,
Mhm.
then you will be born again. You will not achieve moksha.
Okay.
So not all mokshas are the same, right? And if you're a Madhva and you follow the Vaisheshika school, then you will not obtain moksha either. And similarly, if you're an Advaitin and you follow uh, and you see somebody who follows Madhvacharya, that Madhva will not obtain moksha, right? So it's not definitely not that all roads lead to Rome, though this is something that plurality of Hinduism caught up in this template, right? So that you have Hinduism now speaking on behalf, so to speak, of millions or hundreds of thousands of different kinds of worship, right? Is that um, uh, invites this kind of position that Hinduism is teaching that all roads lead to Rome, right? And this has been a kind of a calling card or a selling point for Hinduism, that it's a peculiar kind of relativism, is that Hindus believe so many different things, but finally we all, achieve moksha, right? And this is one, a way to maintain unity in India, right? It's a good kind of nationalist sort of sense. Two, it doesn't offend anybody, right? So if a Hindu so Vivekananda runs into some Christian, he's going to say like, well, finally we all reached the same place and everybody's very happy, right? Right. And three, it is also been, it's also made Hinduism a target for non-Hindus, because they say these Hindus are inconsistent and they're confused and they're not giving really anything that's a substantial religion like Christianity.
Right.
Right. So it's a peculiar and pleasant creation that really corresponds pleasantly with Neo-Vedanta, which is Neo-Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta. But I think that it disrespects the multiplicity of traditions that now consider themselves Hindu, that do not think that all religions lead to the same outcome, right? That there are there's one truth in many religions and they all lead to that. It's disrespectful to think this way, I think, right? You don't take your what I think I've argued this in some paper, I'm sure, is that you don't take your opponent seriously if you think that finally we're going to be doing the same thing, right?
Right.
Right? Then you're not really taking your opponent's position seriously. This is a kind of classic problem we see with interreligious dialogue. So when you have an interreligious dialogue, which I used to be participating in, you have somebody who calls you up and they say, we need a Hindu, we need a Christian, we need a Buddhist. And inevitably that person might want to say that all paths lead to Rome, right? Or, I mean, Rome makes me think about Catholicism. Let's just say that leads to Calcutta. And, but then they don't really care what Hindus believe. Finally, right? So it appears, that kind of relativism appears at first glance to be the most kind of kind and pleasant thing to do, but it really is denying the importance of your interlocutor's beliefs, right? Because finally you're discounting them. Yeah, you might believe that, I might believe this. Finally, we all land up in the same place.
But coming back to that point, is it fair to remodify the statement the way we see in Hinduism in a nutshell, that all roads can probably lead to Rome, a common destination, under a certain specified circumstances?
For Madhvacharya, if you like, a Christian is not going to get moksha unless they're reborn finally as a Madhva, right? Right? Or somebody in North India who is following Advaita Vedanta is not going to get moksha either. And so on. So it's a really strict sense of, well, I'm thinking of like this kind of classic question: is there one true religion or are there many? And in the Hindu world, there is only one true religion, right? And it's Advaita or Vishishta Dvaita or Dvaita or any of the multiplicities of other traditions that are out there.
That's right. And it's a very nice way of redefining moksha. And it makes you think, like when you have given that example that a Christian will not get moksha. When we think of moksha as the ideal destination or the end point as a Hindu, I cannot actually generalize it over the entire population. I have to consider the function of religion, or which religion a person is following.
That's right.
And as we are moving towards the end of this discussion, and I don't feel like honestly ending it, but things has to come to an end, and only then it will be reborn again, as you have mentioned. Towards the end, I would like to ask you a few short questions. And one of the questions is, I have seen that you do a lot of, great stuff if a person actually volunteers for a COVID-19 vaccine, which you have done last summer. Enumerate on that. I would definitely like our audience to know about your philosophy of volunteering for the COVID-19 vaccine, which was a great step.
Right. So this was a great opportunity came up, which was to participate in the Moderna vaccine study.
Mhm.
And um, uh, in considering why would one do such a thing? Like, why does one want to volunteer? And as a Hindu, there are lots of ways that Hindus do volunteer and do think about the kind of the greater good for all of society. And there's a tradition. I mean, of course, there's a tradition in Hinduism of dana, of giving, of
Mhm.
this sort of charitable giving. And there are lots of ways to give in this way, right? You can, of course, kings gave money, right? You go to the temple and you have free food, right?
Mhm.
So, and what else can one offer, right? And you have stories about sages and sadhus who offer their bodies in different ways. I'm not a sage or a sadhu, but you can also offer your body, right? If need be, if you have to defend somebody, then you might offer your body as a shield, let's say. And so, in this sense, I thought about what could I do to assist the world in this way, and as a Hindu, knowing that there is this history and tradition of giving, and I thought that this would be an offering in a way. I mean, in a funny way, we make all these offerings to gods and goddesses, and in my sense, think of this as an offering to everyone. Like I am offering my own body as a sacrifice in a way to to the world in this sense, in with the hope that the phala, the
Mhm.
fruit of this will be beneficial, right? And it seems like the right thing to do it without, and it may not, of course. It's possible that the Moderna vaccine study could have failed. It didn't, right? So one has to throw in there what was taught in the Bhagavad Gita about acting nishkama karma without desire for the fruits of your actions. So I couldn't certainly engage in this study thinking that I would be a benefit in some way, but it should be done merely as a dharma, as a duty, right? That one could offer one's body this way for the greater good. Right? And also in that article that you mentioned, that Hastings article that I wrote, that I was also wondering about the duty of doing such a thing, knowing that the pharmaceutical company would benefit, because Moderna benefits far greater than Pfizer. Pfizer, after all, has, I mean, the vaccines went out this morning in India.
Mhm.
And this is wonderful. And Pfizer and the Serum Institute is making it cheap for
Right.
the world, right? And it's an incredible and important ethical issue that how should these be should there be a hoarding of the vaccines by the so-called first world countries, and so on and so on. And this was an equally important ethical issue to ask, which I answered in terms of course, this nishkama karma, which is that maybe the pharmaceutical companies will benefit, but there'll be I can't worry about that. My duty is to help in terms of seeing if others will benefit from this study and from this vaccine. But it has been um, a humbling um, experience for me, for sure. I'm so glad that I've been able to participate in this way. Um, I'll know only in a couple of weeks. They'll unblind me in a couple of weeks to let me know if I, in fact, got the experimental vaccine. I'm pretty confident that I did, because of the second time I got the shot, I had a fever and so on. So
Symptoms.
it's very likely. But when I look around now and I see people, like millions of people are getting the Moderna vaccine, only 35,000 of us were volunteers, and I feel like I got to have a small effect, right? But it's humbling when I see the what this could do, what is happening in the world, and how many people I can I have helped in some way, right? In whatever way I
Definitely.
could.
For the audience, it's very important. Like nowadays, we don't talk about we don't even think about doing something without getting any fruits. Like even
Right.
if we open a profile on Facebook and Instagram, the first thing we look for the number of followers behind me. So we are
Right.
some way looking for the fruits. But it's very nice of Deepak that he has done this, and the sense of gratitude, irrespective of our existence, is very important in today's world, the world we are living in 2021, and what we have learned in 2020 from this virus. I think this sense of gratitude should be universal.
Right.
So, moving to one of our last question today is, what's your message to tomorrow's generation who
Right.
wants to take up religious studies?
Right. That's a good question. So I should say that in India, the discipline of religious studies is only is beginning. Is that you don't have this kind of abstract conversation about religion and religious studies yet in universities in India.
Mhm.
But with Ashoka University and other institutions like this developing, that over time there may be kind of this liberal arts college mentality in India. But currently there are very few places to do this, right?
That's right.
Right. And it's I can see, especially in India, why there's such a tremendous importance given on vocational training and becoming an engineer and so on, or a doctor or a computer scientist, because the competition is so astronomical in India, and the consequences if you are unable to support yourself are horrifying, right? So
Yes.
it's that that I would say somewhat maybe not reluctantly, but perhaps I'm more embarrassed than I am reluctant, is that that being able to study religion or liberal arts is a kind of luxury option, right? Is that if you are that you have to be in a kind of not privileged position, but a somewhat privileged position to be able to even entertain it,
Hmm.
right? Or you need to be in a context where if it fails, you have options, right?
Hmm.
So here in America, if I had not gone on and got a PhD, I could have managed to have a decent life doing something, I'm sure, right? Whereas in India, if you fail miserably, right? So you have to be in a really kind of fortunate situation to be able to even entertain the idea. You also, by the way, if you're in India, you need to explain that you're not going to be a pundit, right?
Yes, for sure.
Right? You're not going to be a pundit or a purohit.
Yeah.
And I had so many people think I was going to become a purohit, and that it was funny, really. They just thought, oh, he's going from an engineer to becoming a purohit. Like, how is he even going to live, right? It was very funny, right?
Yeah.
You know, my initial kind of attempt to have an arranged marriage was a lot of explaining, and nobody understood it at all, right? So, will India ever be a place where you can study things like religion, or do you have to go to the West to be able to do it, right? And if you're able to go to the West, you're already in a privileged position,
Hmm.
for sure, right? Um, uh, but this much I can say is that whether you're able to make religious studies a goal as a discipline and as a career goal, right? That studying religion a little bit or studying any liberal arts, humanities, or social studies or social sciences a little bit will make you a better engineer, a better computer scientist, and for sure a better doctor. So whether you're able to pursue religious studies as a career or not, it is essential, and we can see that with 2020 and now
Hmm.
2021, that the world will be a better place if you have exposure to thinking about religions, religious studies, sociology, psychology, history, all of those things. Without it, you risk being a very unethical doctor, engineer, or scientist.
Hmm.
And you will, on the ground, face these issues one way or another. Even if it's as simple as in your office, you have people from other religions in your office and you don't know much about them because you
Right.
never studied it. Or if you're a doctor and you are practicing, you will have bioethical questions rise up and you will not have very much exposure to this, right? So in India, it is hard to study religion. It is easier than it is to study religion, to study history, humanities, and so on. And I would urge you, if you're in India, to make sure you take classes in those areas. And I would urge my students and students who are listening in North America
Mm-hmm.
to also embrace the humanities and social sciences. I have so many Indian students of Indian heritage who are scared to take my classes because they fear not getting an A,
Mm-hmm.
not getting a 4.0 GPA, which will prevent them from their vocational training drive, namely to get into medical school.
Mm-hmm.
And they miss the opportunity. And if you go to medical school and you are on that fast track,
Mm-hmm.
you won't have the luxury to reflect on religious studies or history. Really, again, you will not have it. You go to med school, you might have a kind of a class in medical school that does a little bit of this, but not much. So I have doctors who are either retiring or are in mid-career
Mm-hmm.
who consult with me and tell me that they never took religious studies classes when they were in college. They don't know much about Hinduism anymore,
Mm-hmm.
or they never did. Can you teach us something, Dr. Sharma? And they are forced to, or they not forced to, but they come back to these questions as they get older, knowing that they skipped or missed the opportunity when they're younger, right? So you will be a better person, a better citizen of the world if you do something in addition to your STEM,
Right.
right? And if you're in North America and you choose to make religious studies as your career, right, then you have to commit yourself to uh, the potential for uh, poverty, right? And uncertainty. And those are very hard things. I should say, and this is a sad thing to say, right? Is that when I graduated from college in 1991,
Mm-hmm.
America and North America, but America in particular, that uh, was economically stronger in a way, and there was more fluidity, and there was more freedom, and there was more um, uh, capacity for exploration. And now there isn't. America is a lot more like India, highly competitive. If you don't find a career after you graduate, you will owe $150,000 from going to college, and you'll have to pay that back. And you can't just as easily find a job. You have to pay for health insurance. All kinds of complicated things have happened. It was far easier to to land on your feet in 1991 than it is now.
For sure.
Yeah. So, and the PhD programs in religious studies are shrinking. They're not allowing so many students in anymore. Why? Because there are not jobs for them. And this COVID-19, colleges and universities are closing across the United States. Jobs are shrinking in the humanities and social sciences. So, on the one hand, I want to encourage people to study religion and the humanities and social sciences. On the other hand, it's becoming much harder to imagine a future for those students who make it their career because of the shrinking job markets. So, ironically, America is resembling India more so, and maybe India will resemble America more so as it was in 1991,
Mm-hmm.
right? But it's very hard. I don't know how things will turn out. Maybe the economy will recover a little bit, and um, things like a National Endowment of Humanities will grow, and colleges will recover, and there'll be more opportunity for people to study non-STEM oriented disciplines. But it's hard to imagine that right now. I'm optimistic, but not as optimistic as I was a decade ago.
That's
So
right. So that's a very realistic presentation. And I would like to remind our audience to subscribe to our channel because that will keep you posted with more interesting stuff. Or, as I always say, uh, the things that matter to us, if we could bring it in the future. And we will probably get more and more enlightenment as Dr. Sharma has enlightened us for sure with many different perspectives. Thank you, Dr. Sharma, for being with us within such a short time and enlightening us on Vedanta and particularly Madhva Vedanta. We are immensely grateful. Thank you once again. And you have a wonderful day and particularly a wonderful year. Stay safe.
thank you
Namaste.
very much. Namaste. Thank you very, very much.